Welcome. Today is lesson 4.3. What laws recognize the collective rights of our Métis people here in Canada? This lesson is going to be a little bit different. We are actually going to be discussing the collective rights of Métis by looking at a timeline of events in Métis history. So stick around and let's learn something. Today's lesson, lesson 4.3, is all about the laws that recognize the collective rights of our Métis. This lesson is going to be a little bit different. I'm going to go through a timeline of events, of the history of the Métis here in Canada to kind of talk about the laws that have been developed over time. And we are going to start with the Red River Resistance. If you remember back a few years ago, we talked about the Red River Resistance, where the Métis Provisional Government, led by an individual named Louis Riel, he is right there in the middle of this picture, he negotiated with the Canadian government to have their terms met in order for them to enter into Confederation of Canada. This all caused Manitoba to be created through something called the Manitoba Act. And again, this is all review for most of you. The Manitoba Act set Manitoba as a bilingual province which guaranteed education rights for both the Protestants and for Catholics. It also guaranteed that Métis would get 500,000 hectares of land. A lot more obviously happened than that, but this is just kind of like what we need to know. If we move into the mid 1870s, starting in 1875, we're starting to see issues with that promised land that the Métis were guaranteed to have, those 500 hectares. The Canadian government issued something called a scrip, and you can see an example here on the slide, this picture here. Instead of establishing Métis settlements, they issued scrip instead to Métis individuals and families, and it offered them a choice. They can either take this scrip, which can be used in exchange for land, or they could become status Indian under a numbered treaty. What the many Métis did is they went and they sold their scrip. They sold this document that allowed people to get land from Canada, and they decided to move west into Alberta and Saskatchewan instead and start settlements there. The issue with scrip was that it wasn't that 500,000 hectares altogether like what they thought the government had promised them. That's what they wanted. Métis wanted to be able to stay together as a community. What scrip did is it didn't allow them to be all together. Instead, it was land that was kind of interplaced between people who were already on those areas. That leads us to 1885's Northwest Resistance. And again, this is all still a review for you. Louis Riel, he led the Métis in another conflict against the Canadian government. This conflict was in order to protect their land in Western Canada as Canada and its government was building their railway and as settlers were coming through into the West and making settlements. The Métis are trying to protect their way of life in Western Canada. Now remember, they left Manitoba, they went into Saskatchewan and Alberta to start up settlements. Riel eventually is found guilty of treason and is sentenced to death by hanging. And this experience sets back the Métis as a people, sets them back quite a bit. Fast forward to 1896, and we've got the establishment of St. Paul. St. Paul area of Alberta, the Métis established farms on land that belongs to the Catholic Church. The problem here, though, is that the Métis did not have any land titles. So eventually they had to leave, and then the establishment was abandoned. Jump all the way to 1938, and we have something called the Metis Betterment Act, where we have 12 temporary Métis establishments closed. This is the first time in Canadian history that Métis are provided with additional land. So we see some closures taking place, and then we also see some new settlements taking place, and this is land that is provided to the Métis. Kind of what they wanted back at the Manitoba Act, when Manitoba entered into the province and the Canadian government promised them those 500,000 hectares. It's not quite the same thing, but we are starting to see some progress being made here. And it takes until 1938 to actually finally see some of this progress. Unfortunately, it doesn't last long, because in 1940, in the 20 years from 1940 to 1960, we're starting to see some of these settlements starting to close. These settlements, these temporary settlements that they were given, although it was a step in the right direction, it did not give them the control of the land, which is what they wanted. They wanted to be able to have full autonomy over that land. They didn't want to have to be dictated to by the federal government on how the land was to be used. And 4 additional settlements are closed, and that land is being given back to the Canadian government. And you can see on the map here, the stars, the red stars, are the 4 settlements that are closed and that land given back to the Canadian government. Jumping to 1982, if you remember from the last chapter, Chapter 3, all about the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, well, that's what happened in 1982. The Charter of Rights and Freedoms was introduced to Canada, and Section 35 of the Constitution there recognizes that the Métis are one of the Aboriginal people in Canada, and they should have specific collective rights. And that's what all this is about in this chapter, is about these collective rights. So in 1990, we're starting to see some various settlements taking place, and the Metis Settlement Act is introduced, and we get Métis finally getting permanent land bases with all the rights to manage their land. And we have on the map here, you can see these areas that have been given to Métis people, and now they have full control of their land. So a big step forward. Jumping all the way to 2003, the Supreme Court rules that the Métis should also have the hunting and fishing rights as one of Canada's Aboriginal people under the Constitution. And these rights are viewed as inherent. So this is something that should be guaranteed as a right or privilege based on the history and roots of Canada. So now we're starting to see more progress happening for our Métis. So the following year, in 2004, the Métis get hunting and fishing, that's the harvesting rights. The province of Alberta does recognize that under their Aboriginal status. And in 2007, the government of Alberta does place some restrictions onto how they can hunt, where they can hunt, and who can actually hunt as a Métis. In 2006, between 2006 and 2013, we're going to jump back to Manitoba and that Manitoba Act, and we see that the Métis are trying to seek compensation for the land that was promised during the Manitoba Act. I've got a picture here. This is the beautiful city of Winnipeg. If you ever get an opportunity to go and visit Winnipeg, it is definitely worthwhile. But back to collective rights. In 2006, the Métis launch a case where they're looking for the compensation for the land that was promised to them but wasn't delivered in its intention during the Manitoba Act. They wanted that 500,000 hectares together. Instead, they were given scrip. Now, in present day, we did have a landmark ruling. It was voted 6-2, so the Supreme Court votes in favor of the Métis, and the Supreme Court does agree with the Métis that the federal government failed to provide the land that was promised back during the creation of Manitoba. And right now, this issue, even though the Supreme Court has ruled in favor of the Métis, it's still being negotiated currently between the Canadian government and the Métis. And then that leads us to present day on the ruling of the Metis status. Currently, our Métis are winning legal battles that will grant them recognition similar to that of status Indians who are living on reserve. Right now in Canada, we have 450,000 Métis that would benefit from this change in their status. I'm using air quotations. And this would mean that the federal government would be financially responsible to provide any of those benefits that fall underneath this ruling to Métis. But it's unclear what this is actually going to look like. So this is a battle that is taking place in our court systems currently in Canada. So you can definitely stay tuned to that. So we're going to take a look and we're going to compare right now as we finish here. We're going to compare our First Nations to our Métis. So we've got First Nation reserves and we've got Métis settlements. So we have First Nation reserves all throughout Canada and all throughout Alberta as well. For settlements of Métis, in Alberta, we only have 8. On reserves, we have status First Nations. But right now, the Métis, although the Supreme Court rulings are in favor of Métis status, right now that's still in the courts. First Nations, they have those treaty rights, which we learned about in the previous lesson, including harvesting rights. So that's the hunting and fishing. And our settlements right now, our Métis settlements definitely have those harvesting rights. The First Nations, they entered into numbered treaties. Those were the agreements between the government and First Nations. And in exchange for surrendering their land, the Canadian government got the land to be used to build the railroads and various other things that the government wanted to do with the land. Our Métis, although legislation was created by the Alberta government, they are still struggling. And finally, the province, as we saw in this lesson, finally agrees to give them the land. And the official term for those agreements, if you are Métis, is the Metis Settlement Act, which we just talked about previously, and that started happening in 1990. And for our First Nations, we have the numbered treaties, and the numbered treaties took place over the course of many years, negotiating with First Nations on how Canada is going to use that land. What I want you to do is head over to your notebooks and complete the questions for this part of the chapter.